Apache woman knocked on his door wearing only a torn piece of cloth, and he let her stay all night. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind outside had stopped just after sundown, leaving the hills silent in a way that pressed against the ears. The man sat at his rough-hewn table with a half-finished mug of coffee cooling in front of him, his elbows planted on the wood, hands clasped. The cabin was small, one room, a stove, a bed in the corner, a bench against the wall, but it was tidy ordered. The Henry rifle leaned within arm's reach against the wall near the door, not because he expected trouble, but because out here trouble always came when you didn't expect it. His name was Jonah Keene, 38 years old, a man who had seen too much of the world in too short time. He had ridden with the cavalry through the last years of the war, watched too many good men die in mud and dust, then spent the years since trying to forget by working this patch of land he had bought with mustering out pay. The place was remote by design. No neighbors for miles, no one to ask questions about the quiet man who kept to himself. He was thinking about nothing much at all, just the day's work, whether the north fence needed mending before first snow, when the sound came. Soft. 2 quick knocks against the door. Not the hard rap of someone confident. Not the heavy fist of a man. Jonah's head came up, heart knocking once hard his chest before he pushed the chair back. No one came this far without a reason. He stood, slow and careful, listening. Nothing but silence now, the faint hiss of the stove, the soft whistle of cooling iron. He crossed to the door, every sense awake now. His hand hovered over the latch a moment. In his mind ran every possibility. A traveler lost, a drunk from town, someone come looking for trouble. His cabin had been left alone for a long time, and he liked it that way. He unlatched the door and pulled it open. She was standing there barefoot on the hard-packed dirt, her feet white with dust and small cuts, her legs shaking like she had been walking a long way. She couldn't have been more than 24, maybe younger. Her dress was made of deerskin, frayed and stained from travel, the seams coming apart at the shoulders and hem. The neckline had torn low enough that it showed the soft curve of her chest, her skin cold enough to make goose flesh rise under the moonlight. Her long black hair hung loose, tangled with bits of leather and beadwork. Her breathing was uneven, quick like she had been running, and her eyes were dark and sharp, watching him carefully as if ready to bolt. Jonah felt something shift in him. Not desire, not yet, just a sudden, sharp awareness of how small and out of place she looked against the wide night behind her. "You lost." His voice came out quieter than he meant. She shook her head once, still watching him. "You hurt." Another shake, though she swayed on her feet like she wasn't far from falling over. Jonah hesitated, feeling the decision press on him. Out here, a man had no obligation to take anyone in, but sending her back into the dark would mean she might not live till morning. He stepped back and held the door open. "Come in." She hesitated, her eyes flicking past him into the cabin. Jonah saw the way her jaw tightened, like she was forcing herself not to turn and run. As she stepped inside, quiet, almost soundless. The heat from the stove met her first, and she stood still, close to the fire but not touching anything. Jonah shut the door, feeling the cold cut off behind him. He turned back. She looked smaller inside, standing with her hands loose at her sides, back straight, not slouching, as if daring him to tell her to leave. "Sit down," he said, nodding to the bench. She didn't sit. Her dark eyes stayed on him, wary, waiting. Jonah took the kettle from the stove, poured the last of the coffee into a tin cup, and set it on the table. "It's warm. Take it." She moved slowly, crossed to the table, and took the cup with both hands. Her fingers were thin, scraped raw in places, nails chipped. She drank in small sips like someone used to going without. "You hungry?" he asked. She hesitated, then gave a single nod. Jonah cut a piece of the bread he had left, set on a tin plate with a small piece of salt pork, and slid it toward her. She sat then, her knees close together, eating without a word. Not fast, but steady like every bite counted. He leaned a shoulder against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. She wasn't just passing through. No one walked barefoot through the desert scrub at night for no reason. When she finished, she set the plate back carefully and looked at the fire again. "Where are you coming from?" Jonah asked. She was silent a long time before answering. "Camp." Her English was slow, careful, the words thick with accent. "Not go back." Jonah's jaw tightened. He had heard that before. Women driven out for refusing a man or for fighting back. Sometimes for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "You can stay the night," he said finally. Her eyes flicked to him, searching, then back to the fire. She nodded once. Jonah fetched a wool blanket from the foot of the bed and set it near her on the bench. She didn't thank him, but she wrapped it around her shoulders. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled, and the night pressed close against the walls. Jonah sat at the table again, watching her from the corner of his eye, the way her shoulders finally loosened as the heat got to her. He felt something unfamiliar then, not pity, not exactly, more like a cautious sense of purpose. He had not had anyone under his roof in months. This woman, whoever she was, had just made his cabin feel less like a place he was hiding and more like a place that might matter. The fire had burned down to coals, leaving the cabin in a red glow that softened every edge. Jonah stayed at the table a long while, hands clasped, elbows resting on the wood, watching her from the corner of his eye as she sat with the blanket tight around her shoulders. She hadn't moved since finishing her meal. She just stared into the stove like it was the only thing holding her together. He felt the weight of her presence in the cabin. Not unwelcome, just new. For months, the place had been quiet enough that every noise was his own. The sound of her breathing changed the air. "You walked far?" he said finally, not looking up from the table. She nodded once, slow. 3 nights. No fire. Jonah turned his head to look at her. Her face was calm when she said it, but her lips were dry, and there were faint bruises on her shins, like she'd fallen along the way. He could imagine what it took to survive 3 nights in the open, this close to the season's first frost. "Why'd you leave?" Her fingers tightened on the blanket. For a long time, she said nothing, and Jonah started to think she wasn't going to answer. Then she spoke, quiet but clear. "They say I take knife to man." He grabbed me. Her eyes shifted toward him then, hard enough to test his reaction. Jonah felt his jaw tighten, not at her words, but at the thought of what had happened. "Did you?" he asked, voice flat. "Yes," she said simply. "He live." Jonah sat back in his chair, exhaling slow. That was answer enough. The silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. Jonah thought about the men he had seen run out of towns, women too, driven by a law that was never meant to protect them. He didn't like the thought of her out there alone, hunted maybe, or worse, dragged back to the camp by the same men who had turned her out. "You're safe here," he said finally. Her shoulders eased just slightly. Not much, but enough that Jonah saw it. She reached down, untied the strip of rawhide around her knee where the dress had torn. He saw then how scraped her legs were, shallow cuts, dirt ground into the skin. She caught him looking and pulled the blanket closer around herself. "Water?" she asked. He stood, glad for something to do, and poured water from the barrel into the small basin near the stove. He handed her a cloth and stepped back to give her space. She washed her hands first, then her arms, then her face, careful and quiet. When she finished, the water was streaked dark with dirt. Jonah took the basin outside and dumped it, the night air cold enough to sting his face. He stayed out there a moment, breathing the cold, thinking about what he had just done, taken in a stranger, one who might have people looking for her. A part of him said he was inviting trouble. Another part said it didn't matter. He couldn't send her back out into the dark. When he came back inside, she was sitting on the bench again, the blanket slipping enough to show her shoulder. Her hair was still damp, shining in the firelight. "You sleep there tonight," he said, nodding to the bench. "I'll keep the fire going." She looked at the bench, then at him. "Send me out?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "Not tonight." Her dark eyes stayed on him for a long moment. Then she nodded and lay down on the bench, curling on her side, her knees drawn up. Jonah sat back at the table, listening as her breathing slowed. The sound was softer now, steady. He stayed awake longer than he meant to, just watching the rise and fall of her shoulders, the firelight painting her skin gold. When the wind outside shifted and rattled the shutters, she stirred, pulling the blanket tighter, but didn't wake. Jonah stood, crossed the room, and adjusted the blanket so it covered her properly. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at her, the smallness of her hands, the curve of her cheek pressed against the wood. He felt something shift in him again, deeper this time. It had been a long time since he'd had anyone else under his roof. A long time since he'd had to think about another person's safety besides his own. He went back to the stove, added another log, and sat in the chair by the fire. He stayed there until the room warmed again and his eyes grew heavy. Sometime later, a sound woke him, soft, almost a whimper. He looked toward the bench and saw her turning in her sleep, her face tense, one hand clutching the blanket. He stood and went to her, kneeling beside the bench. "You're all right," he said quietly, voice low so it wouldn't startle her. Her eyes flew open, wide and dark, her breath quick. When she saw him, her body went still. He stayed where he was, close but not touching, until she let out a slow breath and closed her eyes again. Jonas stayed there a while longer, watching her until her breathing evened out. Then he stood and went back to his chair. He didn't sleep again for the rest of the night. When dawn came, gray light slipping through the gaps in the shutters, Jonah was still sitting by the fire. The woman stirred and sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders again. "You go?" she asked. "Not yet," Jonas said. "Coffee first." He poured 2 cups, set one in front of her. She took it with both hands and drank. Her eyes stayed on him the whole time, as if weighing whether she could trust him. Jonah knew then he wouldn't tell her to leave. Not today. The morning light spilled pale through the shutters, catching the dust in the air. Jonah stood by the stove, stirring the pot with the handle of a wooden spoon. The beans from last night had been left soaking. Now they were heating with fresh water and a bit of salt pork. The smell filled the cabin, stronger than the night before, warm and heavy. The woman sat at the table this time, the blanket still wrapped over her shoulders, but her back straighter, less guarded than last night. She watched him work like she was trying to understand what kind of man he was. Jonah was aware of her eyes on him, and though he tried to act as if it didn't matter, he found himself moving slower, quieter, not wanting to spook her. When he set the tin plate and spoon in front of her, she hesitated only a moment before eating. She didn't rush, but she didn't leave anything behind either. "You got a name?" Jonah asked. She looked at him, wary, as if giving him that piece of herself might cost something. Then she nodded once. "Taya, Taya," Jonah repeated, letting the sound sit in the air between them. Jonah Keen. She didn't say it back, just went on eating. Jonah didn't press her. When the meal was finished, Jonah stood and pulled on his coat. "I've got to check the north fence," he said. "Cattle find every gap this time of year." Taya frowned slightly, like she didn't understand all his words, so he gestured toward the door. "Fence," he repeated, then made a walking motion with his fingers, pointing north. Her brow smoothed. She nodded and looked toward the bench, as if asking silently if she should wait there. "You can stay inside," Jonas said. "Fire's going. You'll be warm." He stepped outside, the morning air cutting colder than it had been in days. He squinted toward the low hills, half expecting to see riders, scouts from her camp, someone looking for her. There was nothing but open country, the horizon wide and empty. The north fence was still standing, but Jonah walked the line anyway, checking posts, pulling the wire where it had sagged. The routine steadied him. Out here, work kept a man from thinking too much. But even as he moved, his thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin, to the small figure sitting by the fire, to the way she had said her name like it might be the last time she ever told anyone. By the time he came back, the sun was higher, the air warming just enough to take the edge off the frost. He stopped short when he saw her outside. Taya was crouched near the woodpile, her blanket set aside, the deerskin dress hanging loose on her shoulders as she tried to stack pieces of kindling. Jonah walked over slowly. "Didn't say you had to do that." She looked up at him, then back to the wood. "I help," she said simply. Jonah crouched down beside her and showed her the way he cut the kindling finer with the hatchet, short, steady blows. She watched, then tried herself, her grip awkward but determined. The hatchet blade bit into the wood, splitting it unevenly, but she kept going until she had a neat little pile beside her. Jonah said nothing, but something in his chest loosened. There was a strange comfort in having someone else moving around the yard, even if she was quiet. Later, he filled the bucket from the well, carried it inside, and found her sweeping the cabin floor with the short broom. She had taken on herself, her face calm, not asking permission. Jonah stood there a moment, watching her bent figure, the fringe of her dress swinging as she worked. "You don't have to do all that," he said finally. Taya straightened, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read at first. I work," she said. Jonah nodded slowly. That was fair. Out here, everyone pulled their weight or things didn't get done. By mid-afternoon, the cabin smelled of fresh wood smoke and the floor was clean. Jonah fixed a simple meal, and they ate together, still mostly in silence. Every so often she would glance toward the door, her expression tightening as if expecting someone to appear. "Anyone looking for you?" Jonah asked when the silence stretched too long. Taya's hands stilled on her plate. Her jaw worked before she answered. "Maybe, but I not go back." Jonah studied her a long moment. "If they come here, I'll deal with it." Her eyes flicked up to his, searching for any sign that he didn't mean it. Whatever she saw there must have been enough, because she gave a single nod and went back to eating. As the sun dropped low, Jonah went outside to bring him more wood. When he came back, she was standing by the fire, hair loose around her shoulders, warming her hands. The blanket had slipped enough to reveal the neckline of her dress, the curve of her collarbone catching the firelight. Jonah set the wood down harder than he meant to and turned away, busying himself with the stove. When night came, Jonah added more wood to the fire so the room would stay warm. Taya sat on the bench again, legs tucked under her, watching him from under her lashes. "You stay tomorrow?" Jonah asked, not sure why he said it. Her face stayed unreadable for a moment, then softened just slightly. "If you let me." Jonah nodded once. "Then stay." That was the last thing either of them said. She lay down on the bench and turned toward the fire. Jonah sat back in his chair, listening as the wind picked up outside. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the cabin was empty. Night came down fast, the kind that turns the cabin into an island of light against the dark. The fire was burning steady, filling the room with a warm glow. Jonah sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with slow, practiced movements, running the cloth through the barrel, wiping down the stock. The habit calmed him. It gave his hands something to do, kept his thoughts from circling too hard around the woman lying on the bench across the room. Taya had pulled the blanket over herself, but hadn't fallen asleep yet. She lay on her side, facing the fire, her dark hair spilling down, the line of her bare shoulder catching the light where the deerskin had slipped. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. Jonah noticed. He kept his head down, running the cloth through the barrel again, but every now and then his eyes drifted toward her. He hadn't planned on her being here more than one night. The plan had been simple. Feed her, let her rest, send her on her way come morning. But now the morning had come and gone, and she was still here, sweeping his floor, cutting kindling, moving around like she belonged. Jonah reassembled the rifle and set it aside. The fire cracked, filling the silence between them. "You're sure no one followed you?" he asked after a long while. Taya opened her eyes, turning her head just enough to look at him. "No one," she said, voice quiet. "I walk far. No track." Jonah nodded, though he wasn't sure if that eased his mind or not. "If anyone does come looking, you tell me before they get here." Her brow furrowed, like she wasn't used to anyone asking her to trust them. After a moment, she nodded. "I tell." Jonah sat back in his chair, stretching his legs toward the fire. "You planning to keep moving after this?" Her face tightened at the question. "No place to go," she said after a moment. "If I go back, they beat me. Maybe worse." Jonah felt his jaw set at that. He'd seen enough of the world to know she wasn't lying. "Then stay," he said simply. She blinked like she hadn't expected him to offer. "You let me. As long as you work," Jonah said. "And as long as you want to." There was a long pause. Then she nodded once, her face softening just a little before she turned back toward the fire. Jonah put another log on the fire, the sudden flare of sparks lighting her profile. He sat back down, feeling the weight of the decision settle on him. He had been alone so long that part of him wasn't sure what to do with another person in his space, especially someone like her, young, proud, watching him like she was waiting to see if he'd break her trust. After a while, her breathing grew slower, and Jonah thought she'd fallen asleep. But then she stirred and sat up, the blanket sliding off her shoulders. "Too warm," she said simply, setting the blanket aside. Jonah's eyes moved over her before he could stop himself. The deerskin dress hung loose, the neckline open enough to show the line of her collarbone, a faint bruise on her upper arm. He turned his gaze back to the fire quickly, guilt settling hard in his chest. "Who hurt you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer at first. Then, in a voice flat and low, she said, "Man from camp. The one I cut." Jonah's hands curled into fists on the table. He didn't press her for more, didn't ask how bad it had been. He just nodded once. "He won't touch you here." Something in her expression shifted then, like a wall lowering a fraction. "You mean it?" "I mean it." She looked at him a long moment, her dark eyes catching the firelight before lying back down. This time she faced him instead of the fire. Jonah stayed at the table a little longer, but he couldn't focus on anything now. The room felt warmer than it had all night. Finally, he stood, stoked the fire, and set the rifle back against the wall. When he turned, she was still watching him, her face unreadable in the half-light. "Why you live alone?" she asked suddenly. The question hit harder than he expected. He hadn't told anyone in years, but there was no one else to hear it now. "My wife died," he said after a moment, the words rough in his throat. "Years back. Didn't want to be around people after that." Taya's gaze softened. "You still love her?" Jonah swallowed, then nodded once. "Yeah." She turned her head toward the fire again. "Then you good man." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just sat back down, letting the silence settle again. After a long while, her breathing evened out, her face relaxing as she drifted into sleep. Jonah stayed where he was, watching her until the fire burned low. He wasn't sure when he dozed off, but sometime in the night, a sound woke him, soft, quick, like a breath caught in fear. He looked over to see her turning in her sleep, her hand clutching the edge of the bench. Jonah rose, crossed the room, and crouched beside her. "It's all right," he said, voice low. Her eyes opened, wide and disoriented. She flinched at first, then stilled when she saw it was him. Jonah didn't move, letting her see he wasn't a threat. Slowly, her breathing calmed, and she let go of the bench. "You safe?" Jonah said quietly. She nodded once, then lay back down. Jonah stayed crouched there for a moment longer, then stood and went back to his chair. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, he added more wood to the stove and started another pot of coffee. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel empty when the sun came up. The next morning broke clear and cold, frost silvering the grass outside the cabin. Jonah had been up since before first light, checking the fire, putting on coffee, moving around quieter than usual. Taya stirred on the bench when the smell of the beans reached her. She sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her hair mussed from sleep but her eyes alert, watching him as if to make sure he was still there. "You sleep?" Jonah asked without turning from the stove. She nodded once. "Better." That single word made something settle in Jonah's chest. He set the tin plate in front of her and sat across from her with his own. They ate in silence, but it was a comfortable one. After breakfast, Jonah shrugged into his coat. "Got work to do out back." Splitting wood. Taya rose too, setting the plate aside. "I help." Jonah hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but keep your feet clear. That axe'll take your toes off if you're not careful." Outside, the air bit cold enough to sting the lungs. Jonah set a log upright on the chopping block and brought the axe down with a solid, clean swing. Taya stood nearby, her arms folded, blanket over her shoulders, watching intently. When he split a dozen logs, she stepped forward, kneeling to stack them in neat rows. It became a rhythm, Jonah splitting, Taya stacking. When the blanket slipped, She let it fall and worked bare-shouldered, her deerskin dress brushing against her knees as she bent and straightened. Jonah caught himself watching her more than once, then forced his focus back to the axe. Around mid-morning, Jonah stopped, resting the axe head on the block. "That'll do for today." Taya wiped her hands on her dress, straightened, and looked toward the distant line of hills. There was something in her face, a flicker of unease. "What is it?" Jonah asked, his voice sharpening slightly. She shook her head at first, then pointed toward the horizon. "Riders." Jonah turned, squinting. At first he saw nothing, then the faint movement of dust. 2, maybe 3 figures riding slow. His jaw tightened. "Inside," he said, already reaching for the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. Taya obeyed without a word, slipping inside. Jonah stood by the woodpile, rifle held loose but ready, waiting as the riders drew closer. When they were close enough to make out, Jonah saw 2 men he didn't recognize, rough-looking, with dust-caked coats and rifles in their saddle scabbards. They pulled up short near the yard. "Morning," one called, tipping his hat. "Morning," Jonah said flatly. "Looking for a girl came this way," the man said. "Apache girl. Young. You seen her?" Jonah didn't move. "Can't say I have." The man's eyes slid toward the cabin. "Mind if we look around?" "I do mind." Jonah's voice stayed even, but his grip on the rifle tightened. The second man frowned. "Ain't looking for trouble, mister. Just need to take her back." Jonah stepped forward until he stood between them and the cabin door. "She's not here," he said, his tone hardening. "You've asked. Now you can ride." The first man's jaw tightened. For a moment, Jonah thought he might push it, but then he glanced at the rifle and thought better of it. "Fine," the man said finally, turning his horse. "If you see her, tell her folks are looking." They rode off slow, throwing glances back over their shoulders. Jonah didn't lower the rifle until the dust trail disappeared into the distance. When he stepped back inside, Taya was standing near the fire, her hands clenched. "They come back," she said, more statement than question. "Maybe," Jonah admitted, "but they won't take you from here." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why?" Jonah shrugged, setting the rifle back in its place. "Because you're under my roof, and I don't give up what's mine to men like that." Something in her face changed then. Relief, maybe, but also something deeper. She moved toward him until she stood close enough he could see the firelight in her eyes. "You mean that?" she asked quietly. "I mean it," Jonas said. For a moment, they just stood there, the room warm around them, the danger outside making the space between them feel even smaller. Taya reached up slowly, resting her hand against his chest. Jonah went very still, every muscle tight. She didn't say anything else, just let her hand rest there, then stepped back and sat on the bench again. Jonah exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. He poured her a fresh cup of water, set it on the table, and sat down across from her. "You can stay," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. "As long as you want." Her lips curved in the smallest hint of a smile. "Then I stay." They ate supper early that night, both of them quieter than usual. When the fire burned low, Jonas set another log on, making sure it would last till morning. Taya lay on the bench again, but this time she faced him. Her eyes stayed open until it closed. When Jonah drifted into sleep, it was the first time in months that it didn't feel like he was alone in the world. The morning after the riders came, the air outside felt sharper, as if the land itself was watching. Jonah rose early, checked the rifle before he even put on coffee, and took a slow walk around the yard, scanning the horizon for any sign of dust. There was nothing, just empty country stretching out in every direction. Still, his senses stayed tuned. When he came back inside, Taya was already awake. She had folded the blanket neatly and set it aside, sitting at the table with her hair pulled over one shoulder. Her quiet watchfulness felt different today, not just wary but alert, as if she too was expecting trouble. "They gone?" she asked. "For now," Jonas said, setting the rifle back against the wall. "Didn't see fresh tracks this morning." She nodded, her shoulders lowering a little. Jonah poured coffee into 2 tin cups and slid one toward her. She wrapped both hands around it and took a long sip, letting the steam rise against her face. You don't have to be afraid here, Jonas said, sitting down across from her. Taya's dark eyes met his. I was afraid before. Not now, Jonah nodded, feeling something tight in his chest ease at her words. After breakfast, Jonah headed out to work the corral. The cattle had been restless since the wind changed, and he needed to check for broken rails. Taya followed him outside, trailing him across the yard. You don't have to, Jonah started, but she shook her head. I work, she said. Jonah gave a short nod. All right then. He showed her how to hold the hammer and nails steady, guiding her hand once before stepping back. She worked without complaint, her movements careful and deliberate. When she missed a nail and bruised her thumb, she only hissed under her breath and kept going until the rail was secure. By midday, they had repaired the broken section of fence, split more wood, and hauled water from the well. Jonah hadn't realized how much faster the work went with two sets of hands. For months, the routine had been quiet and lonely. Now there was someone handing him tools, stacking the wood he split, keeping pace beside him. When they came back inside, Jonah set the kettle on and glanced at her. Sweat had dampened her hair at the temples, and dirt smudged her arms and knees, but there was a calm pride on her face he hadn't seen before. You worked hard, he said simply. Her lips curved in the faintest smile. I stay, I work. Jonah nodded once, not trusting himself to say more. They ate together again, this time with less tension. Taya spoke a little more, telling him small pieces of herself, that she had two younger brothers, both gone now, and a father who had died 2 winters ago. Jonah listened without interrupting, his rough hands still on the table, letting her set the pace. When she fell quiet, he finally said, I fought in the war. Long time ago. Thought I'd seen the worst of people back then. Guess I hadn't. Taya looked at him, something like understanding in her gaze. You lose many? Too many, Jonas said simply. Men I knew since I was a boy. And my wife, after, got tired of burying people. Taya was silent a long moment before she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist. Jonah didn't move, letting her touch settle there until she pulled her hand back. The afternoon passed in quiet work. Jonah repaired a broken hinge on the barn door while Taya brushed down the mare, her hands moving slow and sure through the horse's coat. Every so often, Jonah would glance over at her and feel a strange warmth in his chest, one he hadn't let himself feel in years. As evening came, the light turned gold, stretching shadows across the yard. Jonah stacked the last of the wood by the door, while Taya stood by the fence, watching the sky change color. When he came up beside her, she didn't step away. This place, she said softly, almost to herself. It feel quiet. That's why I came here, Jonas said. Quiet keeps a man from losing himself. Taya turned her head, her eyes meeting his. You lost. Jonah swallowed, feeling the weight of the question. He said. Maybe not so much now. The fire was lit early that night. Taya sat cross-legged on the floor near the stove, mending a tear in her dress with the bit of thread Jonah had dug out of an old tin. Jonah sat at the table, whittling a small piece of wood down to nothing. The air felt easier, like the worst of the tension between them had burned off. When she finished, Taya stood and slipped the dress back on, smoothing it down over her hips. Jonah's eyes caught the way it fit her, the soft line of her waist, and he had to force himself to look back at the wood in his hands. You should take the bed tonight, he said suddenly. Taya blinked. And you? I'll take the bench, Jonas said. Been sleeping on it enough nights when the fire's low anyway. For a moment, she looked like she might refuse, but then she nodded once. All right. When she lay down later, Jonah kept his back to the fire, staring into the dark until her breathing evened out. The sound was soft, steady, and strangely comforting. For the first time since the war, Jonah let himself wonder what it might be like if she stayed for good. The next morning, Jonah woke on the bench with a crick in his neck and the pale winter sun already creeping through the shutters. For a moment, he thought the cabin was empty, but then he heard the quiet sound of movement near the stove. Taya was crouched there, stirring the pot with one hand, her dark hair falling over her shoulder. You're up early, Jonah said, sitting up and rubbing his neck. She looked over her shoulder at him. Fire low. I make hot. Jonah stood, crossing to check the pot. The beans were steaming gently, and the smell filled the cabin. You did good, he said simply. They ate together, both quieter than usual, but not uneasy. Jonah found himself watching her more than once, noting the way her hair caught the morning light, the curve of her cheek when she bent over her cup. She was still a stranger in many ways, but she no longer felt like someone passing through. After breakfast, Jonah put on his coat and took the rifle. I'm going to ride the east line, check for sign. Won't be long. I go, Taya said suddenly. Jonah hesitated. You sure? She nodded once, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I know hide now. Jonah studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, stay close. They rode double on his mare, Jonah in the saddle, Taya sitting behind him, her arms loose around his waist. The contact was strange at first, Jonah aware of every movement, the light press of her body as the horse moved under them. But as the miles passed, he found himself settling into it, even drawing a quiet kind of comfort from the weight of her there. The east fence line was clear, no sign of riders or tracks, just a few mule deer moving through the brush. Taya said little, but her eyes scanned the horizon as if she was memorizing every landmark. When they returned to the cabin, Jonah dismounted and helped her down. Her hand lingered a moment on his arm, not out of fear, but something else, a kind of quiet gratitude. The rest of the day passed with steady work. Jonah repaired the hinges on the chicken coop, while Taya gathered kindling and swept out the barn. Every so often they crossed paths, and each time Jonah felt the growing ease between them. The silence was no longer heavy but companionable. That evening, after supper, Jonah stoked the fire until it glowed bright. Taya sat on the bench, her legs tucked under her, watching him. You stay here long? She asked suddenly. Jonah glanced at her. 4 years. Since the war. You know lonely? He gave a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. Plenty lonely. Just got used to it. Taya was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I know like lonely. Jonah looked at her, the firelight catching in her dark eyes. You're not alone now, he said. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Taya stood, crossing the space between them until she stood just in front of him. She hesitated, then reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the table. Jonah's breath came slow. He turned his hand over, letting her fingers slide into his. You safe here, he said again, his voice lower now. Taya nodded, her face softening. Then, with a kind of quiet decision, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. Jonah stayed still for a long moment before lifting his free hand to rest lightly against her back. When she finally stepped back, the room felt different, warmer, like something had shifted between them. You should take the bed again tonight, Jonah said. Taya looked at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. There was none. She nodded once and went to lie down. Jonah stayed up longer, sitting near the fire. When he finally stretched out on the bench, sleep didn't come right away. He found himself listening to the sound of her breathing, steady and close. Sometime past midnight, Taya stirred, sitting up in the dim glow of the coals. You cold? She asked softly. Jonah turned his head toward her. I'm fine. She hesitated, then said, You sleep bad. Come. Jonah sat up, uncertain. You sure? She nodded. Bench hard. Bed big. Jonah crossed the room, slow, as if each step was its own decision. When he lay down on the edge of the bed, keeping a careful distance, Taya turned on her side to face him. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the only sound the wind outside and the soft crack of the fire. Jonah reached out slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She didn't flinch. Good night, he said quietly. Good night, she whispered back. When he finally closed his eyes, it was the first time in years that sleep came easy. Jonah woke before dawn, lying still for a moment as he became aware of where he was. The bed was warm, the air cold on his face, and Taya was still asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. Her hair had come loose during the night and lay across the blanket, dark against the pale fabric. Jonah turned his head, just enough to watch her, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a kind of quiet peace. He eased himself out of bed so as not to wake her and stirred the fire back to life, adding a log until the flames caught. The cabin slowly filled with heat and light. When Taya finally stirred and sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, she looked at him with an expression that was almost shy. "You get used to the bed?" Jonah asked. She nodded. "Better than ground." He smiled faintly, a rare expression for him. "Yeah, better than the ground." They ate breakfast together, and though neither spoke much, the air between them felt different, easier, warmer. Jonah found himself lingering at the table longer than usual, not ready for the moment to end. By mid-morning, Jonah saddled the mare to ride into the small town 20 miles away. Supplies were low, and after the visit from the two riders, he wanted to hear what talk there might be in town. "You stay here," he said, glancing toward Taya. "Safer that way." She hesitated, then nodded. "I wait." Jonah's trip took most of the day. When he reached the general store, he kept his ears open while he bought flour, coffee, and fresh rounds for the rifle. He overheard two men talking about trouble up near the reservation, a fight between some young men and traders, but nothing about anyone looking for a woman. He headed home before sundown, riding hard so he could make it back before dark. The cabin came into view just as the last light faded, smoke curling from the chimney. Relief loosened something in him he hadn't realized was tight. When he stepped inside, the cabin was warm and Taya was kneeling by the fire, stirring a pot. She looked up when he came in, and for a moment there was something in her face that looked almost like gladness. "You come back," she said softly. "Yeah," Jonah said, setting down the supplies. "No trouble in town. Looks like we're clear for now." She nodded, then rose and set a bowl in front of him. The beans were hot and well-seasoned, better than what he usually made. "You cook?" Jonah asked. She nodded. "You work. I make ready." Jonah took a bite, then another. "You did good," he said simply. That night, they sat close to the fire after supper, the cabin quiet except for the crackle of wood and the occasional gust of wind outside. Jonah sat on the bench, Taya on the floor near the stove, her knees drawn up. After a long stretch of silence, she looked at him. "You think they come back?" Jonah set his mug down. "Maybe, but if they do, they'll find I mean what I said." Taya was quiet a moment, then asked, "You always fight for people?" Jonah looked into the fire. "Not always, but when it matters, yeah." She considered that, then moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bench beside him. The nearness of her was enough to make Jonah feel the heat rise under his collar. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Jonah said quietly. "I'm not afraid," Taya said. She hesitated, then added, "I trust you." Jonah turned his head toward her. In the firelight, he saw something in her face that made him forget to breathe. Not just gratitude, but something deeper. He reached out slowly, his rough hand brushing a loose strand of hair back from her face. She didn't pull away. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the fire crackling between them. Then Jonah leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't hurried or rough, just steady and sure, his hand resting gently at the back of her neck. When he drew back, Taya's eyes stayed on his, calm and unafraid. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded once. "Yes." They didn't speak after that. Taya laid down on the bed, and Jonas sat by the fire until the flames died down. When he finally joined her, he lay closer than the night before. She didn't move away. Jonas stared at the ceiling for a long time, feeling the quiet weight of her breathing beside him. The thought came to him, unbidden but solid. He didn't want her to leave. Not tomorrow, not ever. For the first time since he had taken her in, he let himself picture a future that wasn't just him and the empty land. A future where she was still here, where the cabin wasn't so quiet. And as he finally closed his eyes, he knew that when morning came, he wouldn't just tell her she could stay. He would tell her he wanted her to. Jonah woke to the smell of smoke from the morning fire and the sound of water boiling. For a second, he didn't remember where he was. Then he turned his head and saw Taya kneeling near the stove, her hair falling loose as she stirred the pot. The sight settled him in a way nothing else had in years. "You always wake before me now?" Jonah asked, his voice still rough with sleep. Taya glanced over her shoulder, the faintest smile touching her lips. I try. You work hard. I make ready. Jonah sat up and swung his legs over the side of the bed. You don't have to. I want, she said simply, and turned back to her task. Breakfast passed quiet but comfortable, the sound of the spoon against the tin plate the only noise. Jonah watched her as she moved, her steps sure, her hands steady. There was no trace of the frightened woman who had knocked on his door that first night. After they ate, Jonah stood and reached for his coat. I'm going to check the west pasture. Last of the fence needs looking at. I come, Taya said, standing. Jonah hesitated, then nodded. All right. They saddled the mare and rode out together. The sky was pale blue, the kind of clear that comes before snow. Taya sat behind him again, her arms around his waist, and Jonah felt that same steady warmth he'd felt the day before. When they reached the far end of the pasture, Jonah swung down and checked the posts. Taya stayed, mounted at first, scanning the horizon. No riders, she said after a moment. Jonah nodded. Haven't been for a few days now. When the work was done, they rode back slow. Jonah was quiet most of the way, thinking. The threat from the riders was gone, at least for now. Town talk said nothing about a search party, no bounty, no punishment waiting for her. He could tell she'd been waiting for him to tell her what came next. When they reached the cabin, Jonah dismounted and helped her down. Instead of leading the mare to the corral, he stayed there by the hitching post, his hands still on the reins. Taya, he said, turning toward her. She looked up, her face open but cautious. Yes. Jonah swallowed, then said what he'd been holding back. You don't have to leave. Not tomorrow. Not ever. This place is yours if you want it. Taya's brow furrowed, like she hadn't expected him to say it so plain. You want me here? Jonah nodded once. I do. It's been just me in this cabin a long time. Too long. You've made it different. Better. For a long moment, she just looked at him, the wind stirring her hair. Then she stepped closer, closing the space between them until she stood almost against his chest. I stay, she said quietly. With you. Jonah let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then, that settled. Inside, the fire was still going strong. Taya set her blanket aside and went to work tidying the table, but Jonah stopped her, his hand gentle on her arm. You don't have to work every minute, he said. Sit with me. She hesitated, then did as he asked, sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed. Jonah reached over and took her hand in his thumb brushing the back of her fingers. You scared that first night, Jonah said after a while, his voice low. I was too in my own way. Not of you, of letting someone close again. Taya turned her head toward him, her dark eyes steady. You not afraid now? Jonah shook his head. No, not anymore. Taya studied him for a long moment, then leaned in, her lips brushing his. The kiss was soft but certain, her hand coming up to rest against his jaw. Jonah kissed her back, slow, steady, letting the moment stretch until the fire popped and broke the silence. When they drew apart, Taya stayed close, resting her head against his shoulder. What about the men? She asked quietly after a moment. They won't come back, Jonah said with quiet certainty. And if they do, they'll find me ready. Taya nodded against his shoulder, her body relaxing for the first time completely. The rest of the day passed with them moving easily through the cabin together, working side by side without words. Jonah mended a broken latch while Taya patched a tear in one of his shirts. When evening came, they shared a meal, then sat by the fire long after the dishes had been put away. As the last light faded, Jonah stood and held out his hand to her. She took it without hesitation, letting him lead her to the bed. This time there was no space between them when they lay down, the firelight painting the walls in soft gold. Jonah brushed a strand of hair from her face and kissed her again, longer this time. When they finally settled under the blanket, she pressed close against him, her head on his chest. You safe now, Jonah murmured, his hand resting lightly against her back. I know, she whispered. And so are you. Jonah let his eyes close, the sound of the fire steady in the quiet room. For the first time in years, the weight he carried felt lighter. The cabin no longer felt like a place he was hiding. It felt like a home. By the time the wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters, both of them were asleep, warm and together. And when dawn came, Taya was still there, still curled against him, still choosing to stay.